Good morning. This is Thunder, the Desert Shaman. Who is Thunder, the Desert Shaman? Well, for those of you who just came on this channel, bear with me for a minute here while I explain to my regular viewers where I'm going with this video. And where I'm going is, a lot of times I might get into a conversation or I might be saying things and I might say something like that I was a drummer or that I was a martial artist or that I was a pilot. Today I'm going to talk about my passions in life, and that's where I'm going with this new series of video. And that will give my regular viewers a chance to know more about me in detail and what makes up my life and the things that I have been through. In other words, more of an intimate portrayal of who I am and what I love and what my passions are. Having said that, one of my passions are drums and drumming and being a musician. That would be my first and foremost passion, probably. Now, if you stick with this video and listen to it all the way through, you're not only going to find out how I got into the music business or how I got into drumming or playing the drums or percussion instrument, and along the way, you will probably pick up some tips as to what you might want to do or what you might not want to do in regards to your career and your endeavors and your motivation. So this would be kind of like sitting down, let's say you had a next door neighbor and you knew he was a lifelong jazz drummer, and you were getting interested in drums as a young man, something like that, and you wanted to pick his brain and go over there and just talk to him a little bit. And that's the way you got to view this video. You got to view it like, well, that guy next door did this, and I know that he must know a lot about this area of expertise or this area of endeavor. So I will ask him. I will sit down in a room in a nice friendly chat and find out a little bit about his history and what makes him tick. So let me start off by saying that I started playing drums and was exposed to drums at the early age of, say, like 7 years old. I was in the second grade, and my second grade teacher encouraged me to join up with the band. And so I did that, and after I did that, I came into contact with a man called Mr. Hicks. Mr. Hicks was my first band teacher. And Mr. Hicks was a rudimentary kind of guy. He was kind of a, let's say a marching king type guy, somebody that was really involved in the traditional methods. So right away I started off with learning the rudiments, and the rudiments are different stick motions that were developed a long time ago in Europe and were basically of the marching technique style. Okay. So here I was in band, and I was playing different instruments. Now let me say right now that I'm going to try to incorporate pictures here along the way. So I'm gonna show you a picture right now of me when I was about 12 years old. And there I am. And I got a little tiny snare drum here that my mom, this is my first drum, got a little tiny snare drum here that my mom finally bought for me after months and months of begging. And you see I'm holding the stick here. And this was at a little party I threw when I was that age, and it was called the Roaring Twenties Party. And of course, my big thing when I was a kid was swing music. It was swing music. I'm going to see if I can bring this in a little bit here. Yeah, that's yours truly. Kind of hard to see, kind of grainy, I know, but this is an old picture. But around my neck, I have kind of like a coonskin, foxskin thing. And of course, I'm dressed up in my dress pants and dress shirt with a tie. You can barely see the tie there. And this was me at 11 or 12 years old, and I was totally involved in a certain era and a certain type of music. Now, my dad was somewhat of an audiophile. In other words, he was into hi-fi at the time. He was into actually making his own speaker system and building his own amplifiers and that type of thing. And so he loved music, and he loved having a good means to listen to that music. And he had music on all day. And this music tended to be of the variety of swing. Let's say bands like Benny Goodman and bands like Glenn Miller and bands like Woody Herman. In other words, the big band swing era. And in some of these bands he listened to, one of the bands was Benny Goodman. And who was Benny Goodman's drummer? Well, Benny Goodman's drummer was none other than Gene Krupa. So Gene Krupa was almost considered a wild man in his day, and just an excellent drummer with all kinds of African overtones in his playing. And a good example of this would be on the tune Swing, 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 okay, by Benny Goodman, and he does an extended drum solo on there. Now couple that with the fact that my parents were talking about Gene Krupa, and the subject came up one day where my dad, who was also a banjo player and in the show business and also was a theater manager and booked many bands, and my mother, who was a dancer, kind of made it all like it was in the family, and they talked about a lot of different things in their younger years and how they went to concerts or they saw the band Benny Goodman. And in this whatever arena or whatever auditorium they were in, this drummer, Gene Krupa, got them whipped up into a frenzy, and he was such a good connector with the audience, let's say. He connected so well with the audience that he had them going. And my parents used to say they stood there and went, "Go, Gene, go. Go, Gene, go. Go, Gene, go." And you can just imagine the excitement in the auditorium. Well, that rubbed off on me as a kid. And so from that time forward, Gene Krupa became somewhat of an idol of mine. Somebody that I wanted to be like as a kid. Now, here's a picture of Gene. This is quite a nice picture that I got a lot of pictures that I saved in my archives, and it's going to come in real handy for this video. So here he is looking dapper in his brown suit and matching tie. And the look on his face tells it all. He's sure of himself, and he knows his strengths, and he knows who he is, and he's a determined person. And here you have the drum set he played at the time, which was a Slingerland drum set, Slingerland. And this was at the time that he would have been in the Benny Goodman band. So this was the first guy that I really got into as a drummer, as a wannabe drummer even. So what I did from that point onward was to try to endeavor to emulate, his style, his actual drum solos. I memorized every one of his drum solos, especially the one off of Sing, Sing, Sing. I memorized that drum solo down to the T and had that in my little quiver of knowledge. And I tried to start different bands, and I did start different bands with some of the guys that were in band class. And at that time, I was living in a place in Arizona called Scottsdale, Arizona. And that's where that first picture was taken. And that's the time that I started getting together with other guys that, like I say, were in band class. And I can remember Scott Frazier and some of the other names escape me, but I did start a little quartet, and we did our thing as good as we could do it, not knowing too much, really. I mean, just starting on the road to discovering jazz and discovering ourselves, for that matter. So that was kind of my first exposure to things through my dad, through the big band style swing stuff, through searching on my own for friends that played different instruments that I could hook up with and form bands with. So after that, the rest is pretty much history. The next thing I attempted to do, or actually I did do quite well, is when I got a little bit older, say around the age of 16, of course I was continually practicing and continually doing my endeavors to better myself as a drummer, and went through several teachers. One guy was from the Navy, and he came out and he actually, this is a mind blower, he actually made steel drumsticks. And so he was one of my teacher, and he used these steel drumsticks to strengthen my hands. He put them in my hands and said, just mess around with these for a while and it'll strengthen your hands and your fingers. Well, I did that. And I continued to pursue my endeavors. So the next thing you know, I was looking for a place to, let's say, make an appearance, make my debut or whatever. And my parents used to go to this little bar out by Scottsdale, in between Scottsdale and Tempe, Arizona. And they had a lounge in there, and they had a little jazz band. And I also think that there was food in there. There might have been food in there as well. But whatever it was, they were allowed to bring me in at the age of 16. So consequently, I would go in there and sit and listen to these jazz trio or jazz quartet play different songs. And of course, they played the famous song Caravan, which has a big drum solo in it. So what did I do? I heard that song, and then I proceeded to find that on a record. See, we didn't have we didn't have Google and YouTube and all that stuff back then when I was a kid. You had to go search for stuff. You had to find the record for it. And you actually had to learn the tune off the record, okay? And so I searched for that song, Caravan, which had a big drum solo in it. Next thing you know, I'm pretty proficient. And what do? Well, I started playing in bars when I was 16 because next thing you know, I was on stage sitting in with these guys and playing Caravan to the applause of the crowd. Well, that pretty much sealed it for me, because when I felt the energy from the crowd and when I felt the appreciation as me, for me as a young man, playing that tune, again, that kind of sealed it for me, and I was on my way. Now, when I reached the age of 16, a lot of things started popping, and one of the things that started popping is I moved to the West Coast from Arizona. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Arizona, and I grew up there, and I tracked there as a boy, and I did all kinds of things. But when I was 16, I made a trip over and stayed in California for the rest of my time or the rest of my, let's say the rest of my exploration in the field of music, and things were popping on California coast, nothing like Arizona. It was a world of night and day. When you got to the coast, you were exposed to all kinds of things, and so consequently, I joined the bands in high school and had different teachers in high school, and then got exposed to a lot of different guys playing music, either in high school or just on the side, guys that you would meet, your friends, your buddies. Well, of course, I gravitated to people that were musicians or had something to do with music. However, before now that I think about it, see, when I start talking about this thing, about music, things start coming to me. At 16, before I actually went to the West Coast, I had been exposed to quite a few musicians, and I formed a band with some other guys that was starting to go off in a different direction than from what I learned from my parents. In other words, yes, the swing thing was still there, but then as a young man, I started getting into things like blues, okay? And one of the blues bands that I got into were a group from England called the Yardbirds. And who did they have in it? The Yardbirds had in Jeff Beck. That was one of the first bands that he was in. And so I got exposed to that aspect, and the name of that band was the Yardbirds. And so the guys that I formed the band with loved the Yardbirds, and so we started learning the tunes that they knew and started playing their covers. And a cover is a tune that is popular. Started playing them, and then that led us to other forms because then we endeavored to find out where this blues influence came from, and it came from none other than people like Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters, and guys that were early American, Afro-American musicians, okay? And so as we endeavored to get into that further, we got better and better, and we played little jobs, little parties, all kinds of little different places. We played around town, and we got quite well known. And we got so well known that at some point, and I forget how it exactly happened, that when James Brown, who was huge back then, James Brown, the godfather of soul, came into town, he had a penthouse party because he was doing a concert there, and he had a penthouse party, and we were invited to play at that party. Well, that was phenomenal for us. And as we were wandering around the penthouse up there, and I can't tell you all the kinds of things that were going on. I don't want this video to be but there were all kinds of things going on in that party, and there was a stage and set up in there. I mean, it was huge. It was a penthouse. And on this stage was yours truly with this band, and we called our band Saturday's Children. Saturday's Children. And also that night, James Brown's band, Rhythm Section, not his whole band, his Rhythm Section, maybe a couple of horn players and a bass player, and drummer, that type of thing, got up on stage and played for hours. Well, what an exposure for a young guy to be exposed to the roots of what they call funk, or, rhythm and blues, soul, and funk music to the extreme. So as we played that party, we got even more well known, and there were Hollywood types there and managers and all kinds of stuff, and we actually got offered a recording contract, but that's a whole nother story. And I won't get into that because I want to try to keep this video somewhat short so that the people that come in don't think that this is just a guy talking and I may have to do a part 2 because I don't want to make this too long either. I might have to do a part 2. Incidentally, this is a picture of James Brown on his knees doing his spectacular dancing and singing, and just a lot of modern artists got their stuff from him, like Prince and Michael Jackson and others actually emulated James Brown. So let's get back to when I went to California. So then I went to California, and like I say, I met all kinds of guys there. Going to have to excuse me on the chronology here because I remember things, then I might have to go back and pick up a few things, but I think that you'll find everything here pretty interesting. So as I went to California, I started getting exposed to all kinds of different things, and it started getting into the era of the 60s. And yeah, I was a surfer, and I was a typical Cali boy, California boy, just doing the things that seemed like fun. So we'd surf in the day, and then I'd get together with my friends and we'd jam at night. And come to find out, I'd find more and more guys, and then I'd find guys that already had bands that needed a drummer. And it was in the 60s, and so that led to the formation of a group after the Saturday's Children. I think was Maya was the name of the band, Maya. Well, I had no idea what that even meant, Maya, but it was actually a name that the guitar player in my first band, Saturday's Children, was. He was a pretty hip character, and he knew about all kinds of Hindu stuff and Hindu mythology and things of that nature. And so the band ended up being called Maya, okay, which means illusion, or a form of illusion. And that band got to be huge in the San Diego area and around Southern California, and was the first springboard for me off into like being a real professional musician. Now, did we do a lot of things that weren't too professional? Well, yeah, we played at all the love-ins. And back then in the 60s, you had love-ins in the park, and you had bandstands, and you had groups that were playing all over the place. And we were one of those groups, and we were very highly respected and appreciated around that area. And we got to be quite well known, and we played all kinds of places that were big in the hippie era. There was one place that was downtown San Diego called the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome. And what it was an old skating rink that they converted over into a place to have concerts. And there would be all kinds of bands coming in there, and I got all kinds of exposure to bands that were big at the time, like the Paul Butterfield Blues Band was one band that I got exposed to. And actually, we opened for them, and we hung out with them. And so it was a thing where we were constantly rubbing shoulders with the heavyweights, what we considered the heavyweights. So you had the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and you had the Buddy Miles Express, and you had, guys like different blues guys come in, like B.B. King, and just a host of guys that were big in that time period, big in the 60s, okay? And I can even remember going to a party with Buddy Miles, and us all sitting around in a circle and laughing and getting high. Of course, we all did that back then. And playing different rhythm instruments and just having a whole lot of fun in those days. Next thing you know, we were going back and forth. We were starting to commute back and forth between LA, which was the hub of where everything was happening in the music industry. And me and my friends would go back and forth in particular, it was usually me and the bass player, a guy named Tim Cash, would go up and go to Hollywood and hang around the Strip and go to the Whiskey A Go-Go and hit all these different places that were big in that time period, especially the Whiskey A Go-Go. And then we made connections up there. And as we did this, we found out that people would listen to these very crude recordings that we had. Back then, you didn't even have, I'll tell you how obsolete it was back then. Sometimes they have even what they call wire recorders, which actually is recording on a wire. And that was actually cheaper to go in and get a demo done with that and then have it transferred to an actual record. And we got noticed, okay, and the next thing we know, we're playing at the infamous Sea Witch, the Sea Witch on the Sunset Boulevard, 77 Sunset Strip, right next to the place where they had that TV show. So things got pretty hectic, and there was a big heyday of the 60s music, and us getting noticed, and us even getting offered to play at the Fillmore West, and all kinds of things. That whole time period was almost a blur for me. But it was a time period in the 60s where new things were being born and new things were coming into existence and a new consciousness was starting to form. And that would be the consciousness of the music of that time and the revolutionary thought of that time and the whole the whole hippie culture and the whole endeavor to break out of the shell of conformity. And so you had all kinds of artists that you were exposed to, like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and all kinds of different innovators and things that were just mind-blowing at the time. Now, all the time that I was going through this, I never forgot my roots. I never forgot the jazz thing. I never forgot any of that. And as time goes on, when you experience different things as a musician, you start developing an evolutionary process, so to speak. And that evolutionary process leads you to, as time goes on, maybe form different bands out of an original band, meet new guys, form different different rhythm sections, different lead men, different singers, all in trying to stay with the flow of music. So what it led to is one band after another band, and pretty soon you were like totally in the band scene, you were totally in the music business, which is another thing I'll touch upon. So, like I said, I never forgot my jazz roots, and as time went on and bands evolve, I started thinking more and more about my original. I was pretty good at playing all the funk and all the rhythm and blues. In fact, our band wouldn't listen to anything else except black artists and Motown, and because our band was mainly a funk band or a soul band, and that's all we listened to was James Brown and Otis Redding and the Platters and the Temptations and the Bobby Blue Bland, and the list goes on and on and on of the great artists of that time from the black genre or the rhythm and blues genre. And actually that was a more technical style of playing than the normal, like, say, pop songs. And there were a lot of pop songs in that day. So as I progressed along, I started thinking more and more about my roots. And I actually got to the point where I felt like I had to leave the band that I was in, which was pretty famous and pretty well known and playing a lot of gigs around town and that type of thing. And I decided that I had to leave that band. And that happened to correlate with the same time Miles Davis, who is just a great jazz trumpeter, was coming out on the scene with what they would call fusion music. Now he was a great innovator in jazz and bebop in the cool era, and he was the king of the trumpet, born in Storyville and that whole section of New York where artists like Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and the early greats would all have cutting contests, and they would all try to outdo one another, and they were on stage and playing all the time, and it was just a party central. Miles came from that, Miles Davis. And when he came back on the scene, he was always an innovator, and now he was integrating the jazz music with a funky beat. Well, that was right up my alley, because at that time I had learned how to play funk and rhythm and blues, but also I had that jazz background, and I knew about what swing was and what straight ahead jazz was. And so consequently, I got into going back to my roots somewhat and picking up on what Miles was doing. Well, that just started a whole nother avenue of my rebelliousness, as far as not always going with the crowd, but wanting to go with the cutting edge stuff. So as time goes on here, you get to be kind of even shunned by those guys that think, let me tell you what a problem here is in the music business. It is, if you grow faster and you evolve quicker and you're more cutting edge and you have more of a, let's say, varied background, or you like to push the envelope in the music, you like to always be progressing. Some guys are just satisfied with being in one particular type of band, like a rock band or a soul band or whatever, and they never want to progress. Well, I was always one of those guys that wanted to push ahead and progress and stay with the cutting edge stuff. So at that particular time, I had to shift my focus into a whole new group of guys that were more into that kind of thing. And actually, my thing was that I tried to get with guys that were better than I was and knew more about certain things. And so consequently, what I did then was I shifted my focus to guys in town that were actually jazz musicians. And then, of course, I was always going back and forth between Southern California and Las Vegas, Nevada. And a lot of stuff was happening in Vegas. And a lot of the guys that I knew in San Diego were going over to Vegas, and they were playing in what they called the pit bands. And the pit bands were the bands that were in front of the showgirls down in the pit off the stage. And every major hotel had a pit band. And these guys were top-notch players that could sight read music, and they knew jazz, and they had to play all kinds of different styles of jazz and styles of music, and they did a lot of things that were not what I would normally experience in San Diego. So of course I had to go to Vegas a lot, and I would hang out with these guys, and I'd pick their brain, and I'd beg them to have little jam sessions. And at these jam sessions, they would teach me things that I didn't know, or train me in ways that I didn't know. And I always tried to pick up on new and cutting edge stuff. So I can see that I'm coming up on the 34-minute mark here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a part 2 on this, and we'll start with the era when I come back on part 2. We'll start with the era of the transition from the 60s, more going into the 70s, and my transition as an artist going into the more jazz-oriented, fusion-oriented end of things. So I'll leave it there today. I hope you enjoyed the first part of this video, and there's much more to come. Many experiences that I can tell you about, and the journey has just begun. So if you want to be a drummer, you want to be a musician, well then I suggest that you listen to this video and kind of look at all the history of what I went through, and a lot of stuff coming up about the music business and the cutthroat end of it and the fun end of it. So I will continue on at that point, and until then I'll just say adios and catch you on the flip side.